Well, hello again. And we have in the last podcast been exploring some of the advantages of commercial real estate. And just as a refresher, we said that one of the big advantages of commercial real estate over residential is lease duration. Leases tend to be longer. They tend to be measured in multiple years rather than what's typical for a residential tenancy agreement, which is a 12-month lease or 12-month tenancy. And very often at the end of a 12-month tenancy, sometimes they renew for another year, but very often it reverts to month by month. So that's number one. We talked about assignment of lease, where often a lease will get assigned when the business sells. And I gave the example of one shop I had, one commercial tenant, where the business changed hands 5 times during the duration of the lease, which means I literally had 6 people lined up to pay the rent. If the current tenant failed to pay the rent, the person that sold the lease to him or sold the business to him would pick up the slack, and so on for the remaining 5 previous business owners. So that gives you great certainty of collecting rent. We talked about the fact that tenants pay the outgoings on a commercial lease. Now, this is not always the case, but it's very typical. We end up with what's called a triple net lease. This is where the lease payments are net of the property taxes, insurance, and maintenance, meaning the tenants pay those items in addition to the base rent. So very interesting situation, and it's just one of the tremendous advantages. It means the rent you collect represents a higher return, because with residential property, usually the landlord ends up paying those outgoings out of his rental income, and it reduces his return. Whereas with commercial real estate, the tenants pay those expenses in addition to paying the rent. It just makes it more efficient. We talked about the fact that tenants tend to earn their income on the commercial premises. What does that mean? It means they have a vested interest in keeping those premises looking great. And when that's the case, they tend to keep the building in a good state of repair. It's to your advantage. Not only do they earn their income there and therefore want to keep the place looking good, they'll often suggest improvements. Can we do this to it? Can we do that to it? Can we build a canopy? Can we improve the window? Can we do this or that? Now, occasionally, the tenant will ask the landlord to pay for the cost of a repair. And I gave an example of where a tenant wanted a new glass wall at the front of the building, and the cost of it was $100,000. And the tenant asked me, the landlord, if I'd be willing to fork that money out. And you might initially think, well, why would you do that? That's a big expense. But most commercial lease documents have a clause whereby if a tenant requests that a certain improvement is made, and if the landlord should agree to that, then what happens is that the tenant will pay a certain percentage of the cost of that improvement in the form of extra rent. So the tenant didn't have $100,000 to spare that they wanted to put into making this improvement, but they were happy to pay, I think it was at the time, 6% interest on the cost of that improvement. So I had 2 choices. I could either pay for the improvement outright, $100,000, and collect an extra $6,000 in rent. That's a 6% return. That's not bad. But what I opted to do is I had the improvement made. I spent the $100,000, and then I got a new appraisal. The value of the building went up by way more than the cost of making that improvement. It went up by about $200,000. I went to the bank and got a modest 50% mortgage on that increase in value. And believe it or not, 50% of $200,000 is $100,000. It's the cost that I had spent. So now, of course, I had to pay interest on it. But at around, I think, 4% interest, I was collecting 6%. It was only costing me 4%. I was making 2%. Now, 2% you may think is not a lot of money, but it was no longer on my money. It was on the bank's money. So in this case, I had a choice of spending $100,000 and earning 6%, or spending nothing and earning 2%. And my point is, you can do this with commercial real estate in a way that you can't with residential real estate. But I want to talk about some of the other advantages, just to round it off, of commercial real estate. And one of them has to do with the certainty of collecting rent. Because it seems that almost all over the world, if a residential tenant can't pay the rent, you can't just evict the tenant straight away. And maybe that's the way it should be. Some places are harsher than others. So in California, for instance, if a tenant doesn't pay the rent, the underlying assumption is that it's not the tenant's fault. The tenant is the poor, unsuspecting, kind, friendly, and generous person. And the fact that he can't pay the rent is not a reflection on him, but a reflection on society. Society hasn't given him the job or given him the salary that he deserves to pay a fair rent. So when he can't pay the rent, it's society's fault, and the landlord is part of society. It's more the landlord's fault than the tenant's fault. So in California, you can't even begin to take action for 90 days. And in case you're wondering, why would it be this skewed? Why is the law so seemingly in favor of the tenant rather than the landlord? I personally believe it's simply because there are way more tenant voters than there are landlord voters. So if a politician goes up on a platform and says, there's no earthly reason why a landlord should be able to jack the rent up to anything he sees fit. We should limit them to CPI increases. And if a tenant, for no fault of their own, the poor tenant, if they can't pay the rent, the landlord shouldn't be able to evict them within 3 milliseconds. Let's make it 3 months. I mean, you get a lot of people voting in favor of that and very few landlords left to vote against it. So these laws are enacted, and there is a theory that any politician can get elected so long as the number of people to whom they promise benefits like free ice creams is greater than the number of people they have to tax to pay for those things like the ice creams. And generically, this kind of makes sense. And that's why I think it's easier to come up with a policy that favors tenants than one that favors landlords, because there are more tenant voters than landlord voters. Be that as it may, in some parts of the world, it's exceedingly difficult to evict a tenant, even though he hasn't paid the rent for months at a time. And that is why if you have a tenant who rents his home and he rents his commercial premises, because there are no similar or analogous restrictions on what you can do with a commercial tenant when they haven't paid the rent, usually it's stipulated in the lease that the rent is due on the first of the month, and usually there's a 2 or 3 day grace period, because what if the first of the month is a Saturday, and then the second is a Sunday, and the third is a Monday, and it's a public holiday, so usually you get 3 or 4 days. But if the rent is not paid within that 3 or 4 day period, then immediately there will be an imposition of a penalty, such as a 2% penalty or whatever, and then they start to charge interest on a daily basis for the duration that the rent is outstanding. And if the tenant still doesn't pay, in many jurisdictions, you can do what's called distrain for rent. Now, what that means is you can lock the premises, you can seize the premises. You can't seize the people inside the premises if there are staff or business owners in there. You can't lock them up in there. That would be called, detainment or restrainment or whatever. You can't do that. But you can take the premises. And if the tenants still don't pay, then you have the right under most jurisdictions' laws to offer the plant and the equipment and the machinery up for sale. Now, sure, there are rules. You have to advertise it a certain minimum number of times. The ads have to be a certain minimum size. You have to wait a certain minimum number of days. But then you can sell the equipment and the plant and the inventory and the stock and apply it firstly to back rent and then penalty interest and any other penalties there may be. And by the way, if there's surplus left over, you can't pocket that. If there's any surplus beyond what you were owed, then you have to pay that to the tenant. And that's probably the way it should be. But anyway, there are many powers that commercial landlords have that they can use to make sure that rent ultimately is paid. And most tenants know this. So getting back to our friendly tenant who has both a house that he is leasing and a commercial premise that he is leasing, if he only has enough money for one of those, but not for both of them, then he, in all probability, is going to pay the commercial rent, because he knows that if he doesn't pay the commercial rent, it could cause a major disruption to his business. Whereas if he doesn't pay the residential rent, he's usually got a grace period of multiple months before any serious action is going to be taken anyway. In other words, one of the tremendous advantages of commercial real estate over residential real estate is that your certainty of collecting rent is much higher. In general, you get very few situations where the tenant doesn't pay the rent. And usually if he doesn't pay the rent, it means his business is in serious trouble. Remember, he's running this business because that's where he earns his money. That's where he pays his bill from. That's where he earns the money to pay his residential rent or his residential mortgage if he owns it. So they've got every incentive to keep that thing going. And also the consequences of not paying the rent can be a lot more dire than the consequences of not paying a residential rent. So keep that in mind. That is a tremendous advantage of having a commercial property. And there's another advantage that when people hear it, they tend to think, wow, that's a bit unfair. But when you think about it, it makes sense. And it has to do with rent reviews. We all know that Every time a lease comes up for renewal, be it a residential tenancy agreement or a commercial lease, there is an opportunity for the landlord to review the level of rent. And for a long time in the past decade, there weren't many increases in rent necessarily because the market stayed pretty flat, or it was after the GFC, the global financial crisis, and rents were down. But more recently, in the last couple of years, rents have been going up tremendously. In fact, real estate values all throughout the Western world have gone up in leaps and bounds. And I believe from June 2020 to June 2021, here in the States, it was something like 31%. It's a massive increase. And that wasn't even the biggest in the world. So usually there is a rent review. And here's the difference between residential and commercial. With residential property, there is a chance, of course, that rents go up, but in a depressed market or a market that's gone down, like after the GFC, rents can also go down. Most commercial lease agreements have a clause in them. It's called the upwards only rent review clause. And it's a clause that stipulates that during a rent review on a commercial property, the rents may stay the same or they may go up. However, rents will not go down. And you might think, well, that sounds blatantly unfair, because if the economy has gone down, if the market has gone down, if residential rents have gone down, then surely it should be possible that commercial rents have gone down. The value of the rental space has gone down, and therefore rents should go down to reflect that. So why on earth is it possible to even have a clause where it says that the rents will either stay the same or go up, but they won't come down? And the answer is that by having an upwards only rent review clause in a commercial lease agreement, it enables commercial landlords to offer a lower base rent than they would otherwise have to offer if they knew that rents could go up or down. If rents could go up and they could also go down, then generally commercial landlords would charge a higher base rent to cover the situation where if rents come down, they won't be able to pay their own mortgage. The commercial landlord may not be able to pay the commercial loan mortgage, the payments on the commercial loan to buy that building. So they can offer a lower base rent. So in that sense, it benefits everyone and it gives more stability in the market. That stability, by the way, is enhanced by the fact, and we touched on this before, that residential rent durations tend to be a year, occasionally 2 years, often 6 months, usually a year. Whereas with commercial leases, lease periods tend to be multiple years. They might be 5 years, 10 years. I've been involved with leases that were 25 years long. I've had commercial tenants say, I'll only take this on if you give me a 20-year lease. Now, they aren't typically that long. Very often, they'll be shorter than that. But it is not uncommon for leases to be of the order of 5, 6, 8 years, 4 years, 6 years, something like that. So given that they tend to be longer, that means you've got a greater period of time during which, if you cannot have a downward trend in rentals, that is going to benefit initially, of course, the landlord. It means that you've got the certainty of the rent. It won't be going down. But remember, it gives the landlord the ability to offer a lower base rent. So lease lengths are longer duration. If there's a change in the economy, if it's a 2-year dip in the economy and your tenant has a 6-year lease, by the time the lease comes to an end and the whole lease has to be renewed, or the tenant might choose to leave, that dip in the economy is long gone. It's history. And that is why, in general, commercial property tends to be less volatile than residential, right? You've got longer leases, you've got this upward-only rent review clause. Most dips, unlike the GFC, which tended to last about a decade, most dips are relatively short. And so the tenant is still in place when that happens. Bottom line is, you've got a much greater certainty of collecting the rent, partially because there's an upwards only rent review clause, which means the base rental is lower. It takes longer for things to happen that can affect the commercial tenant. So after 6 years on the lease, or even 4 years on the lease, any small hiccup in the economy has been, it's long history and it's been taken up by the slack. That brings me to another point, and we've touched on aspects of this before, but it's still very relevant and I think it's worth talking about, and that is government interference. In general, again, because there are so many residential tenant voters, governments tend to be involved a lot with the Residential Tenancy Act or the residential tenancy legislation that they have in various countries. There are many people who are tenants. They say that right now in the United States, about 1/3 of homes are occupied by tenants and something like 2/3 are occupied by owner occupants. That means there's a large body of people, a large body of potential voters who are residential tenants. And that's why the government wants to look after them. So there's a lot of government interference. And another way that this manifests is with rent control. Like, I haven't heard of a single instance where the government has put rental control on commercial properties. Like, there's a law that says that commercial rents can only go up by a maximum of 2% a year, or they have to be restrained to the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. But there absolutely and definitely is legislation in many parts of the world that restricts the increases possible on residential property. Here in the United States, there are two cities in particular that for a long time have had rent controls. And they are San Francisco and New York City. And not surprisingly, they are the two cities with the highest rentals in the country. Now, we could sit here and debate whether they have the highest rentals in the country, and that is specifically why we need rent controls, or whether it's because of the rent controls that have been in place for decades that the rents are highest there. But let me explain why rent controls are actually bad for the very people they're trying to protect. And it goes like this. Governments say, you know what? These money-hungry, racketeering, rapacious landlords shouldn't be able to jack the rents up to whatever they see fit. Let's have a government law here which restricts it to the CPI index, because the CPI index is a measure of the Consumer Price Index. So why should rents be able to go up more than the value of a bottle of milk or a gallon of gasoline or anything like that? Let's keep rental increases restricted to the CPI. And on the surface, this seems like a fair thing to do. And everyone wants to be fair. They want to be seen to be fair. So the politicians say, yeah, this is a good thing we can do to our wonderful supporting tenant voters. And there'll be a few rapacious racketeering landlords who want more money, but we're not worried about them. It sounds very fair. But bear with me for a moment. Imagine in a city like San Francisco, it's limited. The land is limited. So when there's an increased demand for rental accommodation because there are 14 new big tech startup companies and they have people wanting to come in, rents would normally double if the value of that real estate is doubled, and prices would reflect that. So the price of rent would double, the value of the property would double. And what would happen is more developers would say, wow, we should get into this market because there's a massive demand for residential accommodation. Let's cater to that demand. So they would start building more stock to pick up the slack. But because of the rent control, because the rents are limited to the CPI index, what happens is rents normally would have doubled, but they can't, they're held here. But values have gone up, the values of the properties still go up. That means that the yields or the returns go down. They've been halved. And a lot of investors who would otherwise have invested in San Francisco would say, well, why would I invest here? Because these rents are limited by the CPI. My returns have gone down. I can get double the return elsewhere in California or anywhere else in the country, so I'm not going to invest here. So those investors invest less in San Francisco. And some existing investors are going to say, oh my gosh, the value of the property has gone up so much. I can sell this with its lousy return and buy something somewhere else in another part of the country and get a much higher return, and I'll be much better off. So they sell their stock, and it reduces the supply of rental accommodation. And with the supply going down, the value goes up. The rents would go up to increase it, to encourage more builders to develop or investors to invest. But it doesn't happen because of the CPI limitation. So you get a black market developing, meaning people say, well, the official rent is $1,400 a month, but we've had several offers that are willing to pay the $1,400 officially and another $300 under the table. You get a black market developing, you get all kinds of nasty things happening, or people stay there, they don't move. I have an aunt living in a flat that she's lived in for 32 years now. Because if she moves, she'll have to pay market rentals. But by staying there, she's stuck at a ridiculously low rental that for 32 years has been limited by the CPI. It is just, so you get an artificial market developing. And in the end, the person who suffers is the tenant, because there's a chronic shortage of accommodation because no one wants to invest there. And what little there is, especially if there's a turnover of tenant, it goes up to market. They are sky high. In other words, the very people designed by this legislation to be protected are the ones hurt. And that is why very often Adam Smith was right. Of a free market economy, the economy will sort it out. Supply and demand will sort it out. This has been seen to be true all over the world where there's been no restrictions, and places where there are restrictions, we get these anomalies. So with commercial real estate, and here's the point, governments tend to do far less to interfere with the market. It is left to its own devices. Pure market forces of supply and demand determine what the rents are. And therefore, if you have commercial space in the likes of San Francisco, which doesn't have any rent controls on it, and if there's an increased demand, then somehow developers figure out a way of increasing the supply. It's a natural thing. It makes complete sense when you think about it. And I shudder when I see prices in New York City and San Francisco and other places, of course, too, around the world and even in the United States where they've got all kinds of government interference. The less government interference, the better. It's not an anti-government stance. It's just looking at the natural forces of supply and demand and how they ultimately work to make the economy more efficient. Anyway, that is not the final advantage of commercial that I want to discuss. I've got one more, and that concerns management overhead. And truly, when I compare my residential properties that I've owned throughout the decades with my commercial properties that I've owned throughout the decade, on average and in general, but with a wide margin of certainty, the commercial real estate requires far less management. And part of the reason, of course, is that commercial tenants earn their income on the premises. They don't want 3 days of downtime because a sewer pipe is blocked. And they want to get someone in to fix it right away so that the clients can use the lavatories, so that their staff can use the lavatories. That's perhaps not a very pristine example to use. But even if there's a broken plate glass window in the front door, they want it fixed straight away because they want their premises to look really good. Whereas when a glass door is broken on a residential property, you find that the tenant tends to call the landlord and says, hey, your door's broken. Forget the fact that they must have been the ones to break it, unless it was a freak cold weather condition and it cracked because of, just, I don't know, it was cold and everything was shrinking, or what do you call it? And it was expanding negatively. I can't think of the word. It's not that situation. It's when they do some damage. They'll throw a fist through a wall and then complain that the wall is drafty. So residential tenants are very demanding. They'll call you and say, hey, the toilet's blocked. And you'll say, what on earth are you putting in that toilet? That's the 3rd time this month it's blocked. And they'll say, well, none of your business, but you better fix it. So you call the plumber and you say, can you come around to fix a blocked toilet? He'll say, well, this is the 3rd time this month. You say, I know. All right, well, how about tomorrow at 4 p.m.? So you call the tenant and he says, no, I won't be there. How about Friday at 10 a.m.? And you're dealing with all of it. There's a big management overhead. Whereas with commercial property, usually if the toilet's blocked, they know that according to the lease agreement, they are responsible for keeping the building in the same condition as it was when it was handed to them. The toilet wasn't blocked before. Now, I know we're going to get into little details here because usually when the toilet's blocked, it's something that the tenant has done, so they tend to fix it, no problem. I had a situation once where the toilet was blocked and the tenant thought it's something that must have happened, so they got people to check it out. And then it turns out that there was a tree that was growing and the roots of this tree went under the building and it hit the pipe, and it was a clay pipe, and over time it demolished the pipe, and the sewer pipe literally got blocked by the root of this tree. And so when that was discovered, that was a building issue rather than an operational issue, and it became the responsibility of the landlord. So I paid for the plumbing crew to go in there. We had to jackhammer all the concrete and open it up and replace the pipe and sort out the tree root and then, fill it all in again. So that does happen. And by the way, that's only happened once, a blocked sewer. No, it's actually twice. In all my years with commercial, I've had 2 blocked sewer pipes that were the responsibility of the landlord, and you deal with it. But compare that with the number of times that I've had leaking faucets or, things bursting, and you're responsible as the landlord of a residential property. Bottom line is the management overhead on commercial property is so much less. I think I've mentioned that. Often the most frequent call I get from a commercial tenant is, hey, Dolf, can I please get an extension on the lease? And I'll look it up and say, okay, but you've still got 4 years left to run on the current lease. And they say, yeah. Anyway, getting back to the point, can I please get an extension on the lease? And it begs the question, why do they want to negotiate an extension on the lease when they've still got 4 years left to run? And we've covered this. It all has to do with goodwill. It's in their interest to make sure that they've got longevity of operation on those premises. Unless the premises have become too small and they want to move, of course. But in general, barring anything else, their biggest fear is that the lease will come to an end and you'll say, we're not going to renew it. Assuming, of course, they don't have an automatic right of renewal, which is stipulated in the lease. So they'll often try and negotiate that. And it works in our favor because I like it when tenants want to get a 5-year extension on a lease that still has 4 years left to run. So it's one of these things where everyone wins by this. That is why, in general, I much prefer commercial real estate over residential real estate. So having hopefully come up with a series of 8 reasons why commercial is better, I'm hoping that you're getting some of that enthusiasm for commercial to say, okay, they are compelling advantages. And it does beg the question, surely there've got to be a couple of disadvantages. And you'd be absolutely right. I can think of 2 disadvantages of commercial real estate relative to residential real estate. And what I propose to do is, in another podcast, I will go over the advantages of residential versus commercial, or more apropos to our topic, the disadvantages of commercial to residential. And then subsequent to that, I want to put a proposition to you, which is, if we can overcome those 2 disadvantages, would you agree that commercial is the way to go? So that's what we've got coming up. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for being here today. I look forward to seeing you again soon. And in the meantime, I want to wish you, as always, successful investing.